The trouble began on a humid Saturday morning when David Carter carried his fishing rod down to the neighborhood lake, the one he had quietly enjoyed for years, casting a line whenever he needed peace from the stresses of life. But that day, instead of the calm rippling of water and the gentle whistle of his line, he was greeted by the shrill voice of Karen Whitfield, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA board, who stormed down the path waving a clipboard like it was a sword of justice, shouting that fishing was strictly prohibited without her express authorization. A rule that had never been mentioned in any community handbook David had ever seen, and before he could even reel in his line, she snapped a photo with her phone and declared smugly that he would be fined a ridiculous $500 for disturbing the ecosystem, leaving him stunned and furious, not at the money itself, but at the blatant arrogance that one woman could dictate control over a lake she did not own. A lake that had existed long before their subdivision had been built, and while David tried to reason with her, pointing out that the bylaws never mentioned fishing, Karen grinned in that condescending way only an HOA tyrant could, whispering that she had the board's full support and that people who don't play by the rules don't belong here. A statement so cruel and personal it felt less about the lake and more about pushing him out of the neighborhood entirely. The fine arrived in his mailbox 3 days later, an official-looking envelope marked with the HOA seal, and neighbors began whispering on sidewalks, some sympathetic, others gleeful at Karen's latest flex of power, while David sat at his kitchen table staring at the paper, his anger slowly hardening into resolve. Because if the HOA wanted to make fishing a battlefield, he was ready to fight in a way none of them could anticipate. And yet, beneath his calm exterior, first sparks of a plan were forming, a plan that would not only protect his right to fish, but would flip the HOA grip on the community upside down, though no one, not even Karen, could imagine just how far David was willing to go. But the very next week, when he quietly began his counter-move, the neighborhood would wake up to the first signs that the war between a single homeowner and an HOA queen was about to erupt into something that would change the community forever. But when David decided to challenge the fine, he didn't just fight back. He uncovered a loophole that would flip the entire HOA power upside down, and trust me, what he did next left everyone speechless. Before we dive into that twist, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss a single turn in this unbelievable HOA showdown. But when David decided to challenge the fine, he didn't just fight back. He uncovered a loophole that would flip the entire HOA power upside down. And trust me, what he did next left everyone speechless. Before we dive into that twist, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss a single turn in this unbelievable HOA showdown. David spent the next several nights researching, his laptop glowing late into the evening as he sifted through property maps, deed records, and HOA bylaws, refusing to let Karen's smug fine be the last word. What he discovered shocked him. The HOA technically had jurisdiction over sidewalks, homes, and shared spaces, but the lake itself was not owned by the HOA at all. It was county property leased to a private management firm that had quietly put it up for sale after maintenance costs became too high, meaning the HOA could make rules about fishing all they wanted, but legally they had no power to enforce them, and more astonishing still, the property listing had sat untouched for months, the asking price surprisingly reasonable because no one in the county wanted the liability of maintaining a natural body of water. David's pulse quickened at the realization that with one bold move he could flip the entire balance of power, not only challenge the fine, but own the very lake they claimed he had no right to fish in, and the thought made him grin for the first time in weeks, because suddenly Karen's threats felt laughable compared to the leverage he was about to have. Still, he played his cards carefully, quietly consulting a real estate lawyer and making discreet calls while Karen paraded through the neighborhood bragging that David would soon be forced to sell his house because of mounting fines. Yes, she had convinced the board to slap him with daily penalties, each more outrageous than the last illegal boat storage. For a kayak he'd leaned against his shed, unapproved landscaping. for the flower bed he'd planted with his daughter, all piling up to thousands of dollars. But David, instead of lashing out, stayed eerily calm, nodding politely at neighbors while inside he was working on the purchase agreement that would pull the rug out from under the HOA queen. Meanwhile, the community was buzzing with gossip, some rallying behind David, others too intimidated by Karen's iron fist to speak up. But the tension was rising, and when David finally signed the papers and became the legal owner of the lake, he didn't announce it with fanfare. He waited, letting Karen dig herself deeper, letting her laugh and sneer and tighten her grip on everyone until the perfect moment to reveal his trump card. And that moment came 1 week later, during the HOA monthly meeting in the clubhouse, when Karen proudly held up the list of fines against David, her voice dripping with satisfaction as she declared that he had set the worst example of community behavior and would soon face foreclosure proceedings. But before she could finish her speech, David stood, calmly unfolded a stack of legal documents, and in front of the entire board and half the neighborhood announced that as of 3 days ago, he was the official owner of Lake Bristlewood, the very lake they claimed he had no right to fish in, and from now on, all community access to it, including fishing, boating, and even walking the trail, was subject to his personal rules. The room fell silent, Karen's smirk freezing mid-sentence, her face flushing red as whispers rippled through the crowd. Because in one stroke, David had stripped the HOA of its favorite weapon and flipped it against them. But while the neighbors buzzed with shock and curiosity, Karen wasn't done. Her lips tightened into a thin smile as she declared that this isn't over. Her eyes blazing with a promise of retaliation that made everyone uneasy, and true enough, the very next morning David woke to find his mailbox stuffed with threatening letters, anonymous notes taped to his door, and even rumors swirling online about him being a power-hungry troublemaker, suggesting Karen had launched a smear campaign overnight. Yet what neither she nor the neighbors knew was that David had a plan for this too, a plan that would make the entire neighborhood rethink where their loyalties lay. In the days that followed David's stunning announcement, the entire neighborhood seemed to split into factions, with one group quietly approaching him to shake his hand and congratulate him for standing up to the HOA, while another, led by Karen's constant whispers and manipulations, began to treat him like a pariah, glaring at him during morning jogs and muttering about how he had bought power just to get revenge. Yet through it all, David remained composed, choosing not to retaliate with words but with careful actions. His first move as the lake's new owner was subtle but effective. He posted new signs around the walking trail stating, "Private property, use by permission only," which sent shockwaves through the community, because overnight the peaceful morning walks and family picnics by the water that everyone had taken for granted were now subject to David's discretion, and though he wasn't cruel about it, allowing families with kids, dog walkers, and elderly couples continue enjoying the lake, he made one rule very clear. No board members, especially Karen, would be granted access without his approval, a decision that made her nearly explode at the next HOA meeting. She slammed her fist on the table, declaring that David was acting like a dictator. Yet when she threatened legal action, David calmly slid a copy of the deed across the table, pointing out in front of everyone that he had every right to control his own property, and if she wanted to challenge him, she would need to spend thousands of HOA dollars in a lawsuit that the association had no chance of winning, a statement that made several board members exchange nervous glances, because suddenly Karen's grip of fear was being undercut by simple facts and law. But Karen was never one to admit defeat, and she doubled down, sending out an emergency HOA newsletter filled with dramatic warnings that David was destroying community unity, and that private ownership of shared spaces was a dangerous precedent, painting herself as the savior of neighborhood values while framing him as the villain. Yet her words backfired with some residents who whispered that it was Karen, not David, who had been ruling like a queen for years, finding people over mailbox colors, garden gnomes, and even the length of the grass, and David's stand was simply the first real challenge to her reign. Meanwhile, David quietly escalated his strategy, meeting with sympathetic neighbors and proposing something bold, forming a Lake Friends Association, an informal group where he granted free access to anyone who respected the space and supported fair treatment in the community, effectively creating a rival to the HOA that was based on goodwill rather than control, and the response was overwhelming, with dozens signing up in secret, eager to break free of Karen's endless fines and petty rules, until whispers spread that the community might no longer need the HOA at all. Karen sensed the tide turning and fought harder, showing up at David's property uninvited, shouting that she would never bow to his tyranny, only to be escorted off by county officers after David reported her for trespassing, a humiliation that sent her storming back to the clubhouse in rage, vowing that she would uncover dirt on him if it was the last thing she did. And then, late one evening, as David sat on his porch watching the sun dip behind his lake, he noticed a figure lurking near the waterline, someone snapping photos of his property from the shadows, and when he called out, the figure darted away into the darkness, leaving behind muddy footprints leading straight back toward Karen's house, a sign that she had already begun her next desperate move. But what Karen didn't realize was that her obsession with destroying David was slowly unraveling her own reputation, and the more she pushed, the more neighbors began to question if she was the real problem in their lives, a suspicion that would come to a head in ways no one could predict. And just when it seemed David had stabilized his newfound leverage, a letter arrived in his mailbox, this one not from the HOA but from the county government, containing a notice that would throw everything into chaos and put both him and Karen on a collision course no one saw coming. The letter sat heavy in David's hands as he unfolded it, the county seal at the top sending a jolt of unease through him, and as his eyes scanned the text, his stomach tightened. The notice declared that the county intended to reassess the zoning of Lake Bristlewood, citing concerns about private ownership of communal natural resources, and that a public hearing would be held to determine whether the lake should remain his or be reclaimed under county jurisdiction. It was exactly the kind of loophole Karen needed to reignite her campaign against him, and within hours she had blasted out a mass email to the entire neighborhood claiming victory, writing in bold letters that David's lake grab is about to be overturned by the authorities, her words dripping with the satisfaction of someone who believed the end was finally near. Yet while neighbors debated nervously, wondering if David had overplayed his hand, he quietly set to work, contacting his lawyer and digging deeper into county records, determined to uncover the full story before walking into that hearing blind. And what he found was both troubling and promising. Yes, the county had the right to review zoning decisions, but unless there was evidence of environmental harm or safety hazards, private ownership would be upheld, meaning Karen's accusations of tyranny wouldn't be enough. She needed proof, which explained the mysterious figure lurking by his lake at night. She wasn't just spying out of spite. She was desperately trying to find anything, erosion, pollution, unsafe docks, that could sway the county against him, and if she succeeded, all of his careful planning could unravel. Meanwhile, whispers swirled through the community as the hearing date approached, some residents openly siding with Karen, arguing that no one person should control the lake, while others defended David, saying he had every right to do as he pleased since he paid for it and wasn't restricting access unfairly. But the division was tearing at the fabric of the neighborhood, turning block parties into tense standoffs and even dividing families who once shared meals together. On the eve of the hearing, David drove out to the courthouse to meet with his lawyer, going over every document line by line until they were confident that Karen had no real case. And as he left the building, he spotted her in the parking lot, standing with a group of board members, her eyes locking on his with that sharp, victorious gleam that made it clear she was savoring what she thought was her imminent triumph. The morning of the hearing arrived with the air thick and heavy, dozens of neighbors packing into the county chambers, Whispers echoing through the room as David took his seat at one table and Karen strutted to the other, flanked by two board members and clutching a thick folder she waved like a weapon, claiming it was her evidence. When the proceedings began, Karen launched into a fiery speech, painting David as a selfish opportunist who had stolen the lake from the community and who posed a grave risk to the environment. Dramatically holding up photographs of algae blooms and litter she claimed to have documented along the shoreline, but David, calm and steady, rose with his lawyer and countered each point, producing receipts of his cleanup efforts, water quality tests showing the lake was healthier than ever, and testimonies from supportive neighbors who praised his stewardship. The tension in the chamber grew with every exchange, Karen's face reddening as her arguments began to falter, until finally, in a desperate move, she accused David of secretly planning to sell the lake to developers, turning it into a private resort that would shut out the entire community forever. A shocking claim that sent gasps through the audience and made several board members shift uncomfortably. Yet David was ready. He calmly pulled out his own folder and revealed a signed statement from the county's planning office, showing that no such development permits had ever been filed, and that, in fact, he had voluntarily agreed to a conservation easement, ensuring the lake would remain preserved and accessible to families for generations to come. The room fell silent as Karen's last accusation collapsed under the weight of cold, hard facts, and for the first time, cracks appeared in her commanding presence, her lips trembling as she realized her carefully constructed facade of control was slipping away. But just as the county officials prepared to issue their ruling, one of them raised a hand, stating that before any decision could be finalized, they had received a new piece of evidence, an anonymous submission that, if true, could change everything. And the official's words sent a chill through the chamber, because no one knew what this mysterious evidence contained or who had delivered it. The county official slowly opened the envelope, the sound of paper tearing echoing in the hushed chamber, and as he unfolded the contents, Karen leaned forward with a gleam in her eyes, certain that this was the smoking gun she had been waiting for, while David sat still, his heart pounding but his face unreadable, determined not to give her the satisfaction of seeing him rattled. The official cleared his throat and read aloud that the submission contained photographs and reports, claiming that the lake was contaminated with high levels of chemical runoff from fertilizers and household waste, allegedly caused by negligence on the part of the new owner who had failed to implement proper safeguards. And immediately a ripple of shock moved through the audience, neighbors whispering, eyes darting between David and Karen, some already judging him guilty without evidence. Karen, of course, pounced instantly, rising from her seat and theatrically declaring that this proved her warnings all along, that David was endangering the entire community with his selfish grasp for control, and she urged the officials to strip him of ownership before irreversible damage occurred. But before her speech could swell into full theatrics, David calmly stood, holding up a hand and asking the officials for permission to respond, which they granted. In a clear, steady voice, he explained that not only had he been conducting monthly water quality tests since the day he purchased the lake, but he had also partnered with a local environmental nonprofit to ensure the preservation of the ecosystem. And then, to the astonishment of the crowd, he produced certified documents from the state's environmental agency showing that the lake's water quality had improved since his ownership, with reduced chemical levels and higher oxygen content. Proof that Karen's so-called evidence was not only false but fabricated. Whispers erupted as people began to connect the dots. David's certified reports contradicted the anonymous packet. Then someone had deliberately created false evidence, and all eyes turned slowly toward Karen, whose smug expression faltered for the first time, her face paling as she tried to redirect the conversation by accusing David of forging documents, but the county official cut her off sharply, reminding everyone that official state reports were not something that could be faked without severe consequences. As murmurs grew louder, another official asked who had delivered the anonymous evidence, and though the envelope had been slipped under the county office door without a name. The handwriting on the packet matched prior submissions from the HOA itself, meaning the likelihood of board involvement was high, and suspicion now hung heavily over Karen and her allies, making the board members at her side visibly uncomfortable. Sensing her control slipping, Karen lashed out in desperation, accusing David of bribing neighbors, manipulating the system, and even plotting to bankrupt the HOA by restricting lake access. But her words sounded shrill against the calm logic of David's presentation, and one by one, community members stood to defend him, recounting how he had allowed families to fish, picnic, and kayak freely while only barring board members who had abused their power, painting a picture not of a tyrant but of a neighbor trying to restore fairness. The county officials, after a tense deliberation, finally announced that the ownership of the lake would remain with David, the anonymous evidence deemed unreliable and possibly fraudulent. And while the hearing adjourned to scattered applause, Karen stormed out of the room in a rage, vowing under her breath that this wasn't the end, leaving her supporters scrambling to distance themselves from her growing scandal. That night, back at his home overlooking the calm, moonlit lake, David allowed himself the smallest sigh of relief, yet he knew better than to believe the battle was over. Karen had lost in public, but that only made her more dangerous in private, and sure enough, as the days passed, strange things began happening around his property. Trash dumped at his driveway, threatening notes slipped under his door, and even dead fish mysteriously floating near his dock. All signs of sabotage designed to paint him negligent. But the turning point came when one of his own neighbors, a quiet man who had rarely spoken at meetings, knocked on his door late at night, nervously glancing over his shoulder before admitting that he had overheard Karen plotting with a small group of loyalists in the clubhouse, discussing ways to force David out of the neighborhood altogether, even if it meant bending laws or fabricating more lies. A revelation that made David's blood run cold because it confirmed what he had suspected all along. Karen wasn't just fighting to control the HA. She was waging a personal war to crush him, and unless he acted swiftly, she might just drag the entire neighborhood into chaos to get her way. The question now was how far she was willing to go, and as David sat awake into the early hours, staring at the rippling water of the lake he had fought so hard to protect, he realized that the real showdown with Karen hadn't even begun. The tension in the neighborhood thickened like storm clouds as Karen's vendetta escalated from whispers and newsletters to coordinated acts of sabotage that left even her allies uneasy. Yet she pressed on with the desperation of someone clinging to a crumbling throne, her once assured stride now edged with erratic energy, her speeches more shrill than persuasive, but still dangerous because her voice carried influence over those too timid to challenge her. David, meanwhile, grew more methodical, documenting every incident of harassment with photos, time stamps, and witness accounts. Knowing that patience and evidence were his strongest weapons, and when several families who had been quietly supportive finally approached him, confessing that Karen had pressured them to sign complaints against him under threat of fines for trivial infractions, David realized the scope of her manipulation ran deeper than he had imagined, a rot at the very core of the HOA. Determined not to let her reign of fear continue, he began organizing meetings of his own, inviting neighbors into his home and offering transparency about his ownership of the lake, showing them the conservation easement, the water test results, and even his maintenance receipts, transforming suspicion into trust as more residents began to see him as the neighbor fighting for fairness rather than the villain Karen painted him to be. Momentum shifted gradually but unmistakably until whispers spread that a recall vote against the HOA board might be possible, a concept that both thrilled and terrified the community, for no one had ever dared attempt such a thing under Karen's rule. Yet the idea lit a spark of hope that grew with each quiet conversation. Karen, sensing the tide turning, grew increasingly frantic, plastering flyers about David's tyranny on mailboxes, staging confrontations in front of sympathetic ears, and even calling the local news in an attempt to frame the battle as a community being held hostage by one man. But her efforts backfired when reporters asked for proof, and she had nothing but exaggerated claims, while David calmly provided documents and allowed cameras to film the clean, peaceful lake, his measured composure a stark contrast to her unraveling facade. The pressure on Karen mounted until cracks appeared not just in her influence but in her board itself, several members quietly resigning rather than risk being implicated in her schemes, leaving her isolated yet still lashing out. And then came the night that shifted everything. David returned home to find his dock vandalized, boards ripped loose and splintered, with spray-painted words scrawled across the side of his shed, "Get out." The message chilling in its bluntness, and though he suspected Karen's loyalists, this was no longer petty fines or secret smear campaigns. It was open hostility that could not be ignored. He called the sheriff, who documented the damage and promised an investigation, but the moment the cruiser pulled away, David stood alone in the cool night air, the weight of responsibility pressing on him heavier than ever, because this fight was no longer just about fishing or even the lake. It was about the soul of the neighborhood itself, a community held hostage by fear of one woman's grip. And he knew the time for patience had ended, so he began quietly preparing a masterstroke, reaching out to the county, compiling every documented incident of Karen's overreach, every fraudulent fine, every falsified report, and every testimony from neighbors she had bullied, packaging it into a formal petition for an emergency HOA recall vote, the kind that required a simple majority to topple the existing board and force a new election. And the more people he spoke to, the clearer it became that the appetite for change had reached a boiling point. Residents tired of being ruled by fear, tired of Karen's smug smile dictating their lives. The recall effort spread like wildfire, signatures flowing in from families, retirees, young couples, even those who once supported Karen but had grown disillusioned by her obsession with destroying David, until the threshold was met and the county clerk confirmed that a special meeting would be held to determine the board's fate, a declaration that sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Karen, upon learning the news, erupted into a fury so intense that even her staunchest allies began to back away, her voice trembling with rage as she vowed that, if they want a war, I'll give them one. Her words echoing across the clubhouse during a late-night confrontation that left witnesses shaken, and David, hearing reports of her outburst, understood that the stage was now set for the final battle, a showdown not at the lake or in court, but within the very community Karen had ruled like her kingdom, a vote that would determine once and for all whether justice or tyranny would define their future. Yet even as the date approached, a gnawing unease lingered, because Karen was not the type to accept defeat quietly, and no one could predict what desperate move she might make to cling to power when the moment of reckoning finally arrived. In the aftermath of his bold purchase and the ban that sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, Mark finally stood on the shore of the lake he now fully owned, the gentle ripples carrying both a sense of triumph and peace, while the HOA, stripped of its power and humiliated by its own arrogance, scrambled to explain to angry residents how their petty obsession with fines had cost them access to the very heart of their community. Yet as neighbors began quietly approaching Mark, not with hostility, but with apologies, gratitude, and even offers of friendship, the once lonely man realized that his victory wasn't just about defeating the HOA, but about reclaiming respect, restoring balance, and showing everyone that sometimes the quietest person in the room carries the deepest strength. And though the HOA grip had been broken, the story of how one fine for fishing turned into downfall of an entire neighborhood's controlling regime would live on as a warning and a legend forever. And if you enjoyed this journey of justice, resilience, and sweet revenge, don't forget to subscribe, because the next story might just leave you even more shocked than this one.